Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Sam Clark. I'm a cybersecurity reporter at POLITICO. We're here today to talk about the cyber threats of the future and how the EU responds to them. I think it's quite clear we're at an inflection point on two fronts. Nation-state cyber threats are growing. China, for example, is getting bolder and more capable than it's ever been. And of course, now everyone is talking about AI tools like Mythos. And then sort of on a wider scale, there is the EU's more assertive, more hard-nosed approach, both in cybersecurity policy and more generally. So those are the issues we're going to be talking about today with our panelists. We have Antonia Hamidi, a senior analyst from the Mercator Institute for China, Markéta Gregorova, an MEP with the Greens from Czechia, and Joanna Sviatkowska, the Secretary General of the European Cybersecurity Organization. One thing to note is that we're planning a short Q&A at the end of the panel, so think about your questions now, please. I want to start by asking a very quick, very simple question to each of you. Right now, today, what is the single biggest cyber threat facing the EU? Please.
For me, I think just based on where I work, I have to say China and Chinese state actors using small and kind of like small home and office devices to work as a springboard towards other high-value targets within Europe. And oftentimes they do that in a way that we don't really see it, we don't really experience it. It's not like Russian attacks that are very, very visible. So therefore, we tend to underestimate it.
Okay, so.
For me, it's definitely the users, because all the technologies, you know, the AI tools, Mythos, everything is developing so quickly, and we have not yet even persuaded people that Nigerian princes are not that, that do not give away money. And we are already at the AI level, so we need to put in more training, more knowledge base, and we need to do something about the thing sitting between the chair and the keyboard, yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam, for this question. And I somewhat agree, but I would take maybe slightly larger, broader approach. I would argue that the most pressing threats come from all those situations when we are seeing them being connected to geopolitical conflicts. Why? Simply because the motivation completely changes, right? It's not even about the techniques and so on. It's about the fact that whenever it is linked to the geopolitical and political objectives, you do have threat actors being backed up by states, so their capabilities dramatically increase, and their intent is there, right? So the motivation is to either harm someone in a meaningful way, or for instance, infiltrate the most confidential information. And then you, of course, have different consequences of those threats.
I would like to talk about China. I'm glad you mentioned that. I think, given what we're going to talk about, a lot of the sort of most relevant topics come to do with China. So before we get into the policy details and how we respond to this, I wondered if you could, Antonia, just talk about kind of some of the specific examples that really illustrates the way that the threat from China and the way that it operates. Because I think we often, we just think of China as a cyber threat. What does that really mean in practice?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to maybe bring in two specific examples. One of them was a Chinese hack of NXP. NXP is a semiconductor company that is based in the Netherlands, and they actually used a lot of cloud service providers to stay undetected. They stayed in the NXP system for about 18 months, at least 18 months, undetected, and stole, like weekly, they went back to NXP and looked for, well, are there new chip designs that are interesting to us? They stole them weekly, and after a year and it was detected, NXP came out and said, well, this didn't have a material impact on our business, which maybe is true in a sense of this year, but probably in the future it will have a pretty big impact. The second example that I wanted to bring in is called Volt Typhoon, if you've ever heard about it, which was a Chinese cyber attack on telecommunications networks, on energy grids in Guam, in the US, and also in Southeast Asia, and we've heard also some in Europe, where Chinese state actors left behind code that would allow them to remotely disable this energy grid, this telecommunications network. This was, from our perspective, a big escalation. This was the first time we've seen this from China, but it was really, really clear that this was seen as pre-positioning, as preparing for an eventual geopolitical conflict, which is why Guam was, of course, also targeted quite strongly. Since then, we've seen that being part of these networks and being able to disrupt in cases of geopolitical conflicts is part of China's doctrine of deterrence, and therefore is seen as very, very critical for China. And these two examples, I think, really illustrate this, the breadth of really issues that we're seeing. One of them is an issue to our competitiveness from China, and the other one is an issue to really our security and our ability to make independent decisions, even in a case where there might be geopolitical conflict that we often can't control, as we have seen with Russia.
And so that's interesting. And the reason I wanted to talk about China was because the upcoming Cybersecurity Act, on which you are rapporteur, you're leading the work for the European Parliament, clearly is basically targeted at China, right? And it's going to have an effect on that. Can you just tell us, first of all, what's your thinking? You know, we're in kind of the relatively early stages. What's the direction of travel? Give us some timelines, maybe, on how things are going.
Oh, timelines, everybody would like to know that. Well, from the European Parliament's perspective, the Cybersecurity Act is extremely important, especially because, and we've talked about it with my colleague here, that it's a regulation and not a directive, such as NIS2, which was a mistake, and that we will, and why is that important? Because currently we still have 27 regimes. The company in Prague does not have the same conditions as company in Berlin or Lisbon, and then, you know, you would technically need to have 27 or something like that teams or lawyers that would explain to you how to go on other markets. And of course, that's very restricting to small and medium enterprises and companies. And so we are, again, dependent on the few options that we have. Some are from Europe, yes, but most are, of course, from third countries, such as US and China. And you said it, not me, although it's true, that it might be directed to China a lot, but it shouldn't be necessarily just about China, because as we have seen with US, you know, who is competition, who is adversary, who is a partner, changes in geopolitical spectrum quite quickly, or can change quite quickly. So what we actually should do, I will answer to your question, don't worry. I'm getting to it now, and I will use also a good example, which is electric vehicles. I do think, and I hope this is on record, we should get inspired in China. And how? I will explain. Because, as you might have heard, Tesla was prohibited in the past years from entering military areas and airports in China, in Beijing, etc., unless they obliged with the Chinese certification systems and also ensure that the data are stored only in China. Also, by the way, Ericsson and Nokia last October were crossed out from Chinese infrastructure because they didn't want to do exactly this. You know, if China is afraid that somebody is doing it to them, then they are definitely doing it to us. And we should count with that. And we should get inspired in what we do to protect ourselves. So this is about doing the same. Certification based on European standards and European legislation, data stored on European cloud, or, you know, just in a way that we have the keys from it. And then it can be whichever company, you know, it can be even Chinese if they oblige by it. We all assume they won't, but they can, you know, and in that case, it also supports, of course, also the European environment of companies, because then the monopolies are a little bit more restricted and other European companies can thrive. So when businesses tell me, oh, but you want to vendor lock us into 2 European companies, we all know which ones, but you know, 2 European companies, no, it's about opening up the market to competition, actually. It's the complete opposite.
I just want to sort of come back to something you said about the US there, because the way that the Cybersecurity Act has been drafted by the European Commission is that one of the ways in which Chinese companies or any company could be restricted is that the country they come from will be listed as a country of concern. So can you foresee a future then when the US is considered a cybersecurity country of concern to the EU? Is that something you foresee?
Well, I do not think that we are foreseeing something like blacklisting and whitelisting. We'll, of course, see. I am just a measly rapporteur for the European Parliament. There is still the Council and the other groups. But as I said, this should be a systemic solution. So whitelisting or blacklisting is not that systemic because of all the reasons. But yes, I can see the Cybersecurity Act having an impact on US companies if they don't oblige by the rules. Because to be really honest, DSA is sort of a hint on how US companies approach the EU legislation. So I might be actually in 5 years banned from entering the US, like Thierry Breton, maybe, if I'm lucky. But they will certainly be affected, yeah.
Okay, and then just coming back to China, are you worried about the costs associated with basically removing high-risk equipment, particularly if it's Chinese? And the reason I asked this today, we were just discussing beforehand, is the Chinese Chamber of Commerce this morning came out with some figures which said that basically the Commission's estimate of how much the Cybersecurity Act will cost Europe is wrong. The law will in fact cost 370 billion euros. I mean, what do you make of that figure? And are you worried about that? That's a lot of money that you're potentially looking after.
Of course, Chinese Chamber of Commerce and European Commission, whose data is more truthful, everybody can make their own choice. I do think that it's, to be objective, it's really hard to account for everything because, as we know, the developments in all those fields in cybersecurity can very differ. And also, you are sort of accounting for saving certain costs, on, for instance, ransomware attacks. And if you account for that, that can be a huge saving, actually. But you don't know, how much it will increase, how many ransomware attacks you will cover, etc. But overall, I just want to very briefly say that if we are talking about costs in financing for our security and about the cost of our security and also, to be really honest, our geopolitical position, because this is not a technological issue anymore. This is foreign affairs issue. This is single market issue. So if I put all of these things on one side on the scales and, just pure costs on the other side, this always outweighs it. That's not even a question for me.
One last question on this for you I'm sorry. You said, I think when you first got this file, that you were going to speak very widely to lots of people, industry and everyone else. What about, for example, the Chinese Chamber of Commerce? Are you speaking to representatives of Chinese industry? Will you, if you haven't already?
To some extent, my policy advisor have met with some. I personally haven't, but a lot of them did not approach me. Yeah, I wonder why.
And Antonia, I'd like to ask you about last week. So we've had the Chamber of Commerce study today, and last week the Chinese mission sort of made some basically threats of retaliation, and also I think the Commerce Department as well. What do they tell you kind of about the proposal itself and how Beijing feels about it?
What they tell me is that this proposal Beijing is taking seriously and Beijing actually cares about. We have seen quite a few EU legislations that were debated and even passed where Beijing might have made one passing remark of, well, this is not very good, this is not in line with the WTO, and that was it. This is completely different, and the extent of the public relations push that I'm seeing is, to me at least, based on when I started at Merrick's, unprecedented at kind of like what we're seeing. So this shows, one, what is in there is seen to actually have teeth. This is, I think, a really good sign for the EU in many cases. For me, this would be a really good sign. It also shows that China is dependent on the European market. They need these sales because they won't be able to find them anywhere else. The US has basically banned China in a lot of the industries that we're talking about, and most less developed countries just don't have the market scale and or purchasing power to be able to pay what Europe tends to pay for these products. So these are two things that, to me, showcase that this regulation is a step in the right direction. And I kind of like go with what the Australians said when they first got pressure from China over specific legislation and specific actions that they took, which is when you don't take an action because of fear of retaliation, you've basically given up your sovereignty already. That's not something that, to me, the EU should do. And we as European states, and hopefully there will be more unity going forward, really have to also find a way to use the leverage that we do have that is often not discussed enough. And these kind of proposals definitely are ways of, one, making sure that we keep this leverage, and two, also using that to secure our own resilience.
Joanna, I want to come to you. Sort of last thing on the Cybersecurity Act. You represent defenders, basically, cyber defenders. How do they feel about it, and who feels strongly about it amongst your members?
Yeah, so maybe I will start by saying that I'm super happy that we've started debunking some myths already, because, as was said, we tend to think about the European Union as the key regulator and that we focus only on legislative actions and so on, whereas I would like to stress that it's absolutely correct that China and the US are doing similar activities, but they are doing that without screaming and shouting about it. But the effect on the market is very often quite similar. So I think that is also important to put it in this perspective. Now, speaking about the CSA, and obviously we are talking about the part which is relevant from the supply chain point of view. As the organization that cares about cybersecurity, we are quite happy to see that this is yet another instrument that will actually that brings the promise to boost supply chain cybersecurity overall. It is an agnostic, state-agnostic tool, right? So it doesn't aim at any specific country. It should be, and this is how it's been written, risk-oriented, right? Risk-based. So the point is that, of course, we need to analyze a specific situation, consequences, impact, threats behind it, and make proper actions, right? And then, again, you have the full spectrum of different tools and measures, risk mitigation measures that you can apply. So, of course, we are talking about political consequences and so on, but we are taking the most extreme cases, right? There are some other ways that you can apply in the meantime. So, obviously, we need to remember about that, and I see quite a few positive aspects that can result from CSA and supply chain measures. One of them is to seriously increase awareness about the fact that supply chain elements should be taken seriously, concentration risks, various categories of vulnerabilities that can be linked with dependencies on multiple different actors. That's something that we need to take into account, right? And holistic view that European Union can have, thanks to the coordinated risk assessment and so on, that can be truly helpful. Then, of course, at the end of the day, we need to take into account individual situation of various players and tell them, this is the risk, we need to find risk-based approach to mitigate it properly, not to, of course, hamper also, let's say, business and aspects and everything around it. So that would be a very brief answer. And very last sentence, with the CSA and the supply chain cybersecurity, we need to remember that this is one out of many tools that the EU proposed, and they should be, in my view, taken holistically. NIS2, CRA, and finally DORA. That's a clear message. Supply chain cybersecurity is a top concern, and it has different flavors.
I want to stick with you, Joanna, but kind of move to something different, which is, of course, AI, Mythos, and other tools like it. This obviously really changes the game for cybersecurity, basically. You, as I said, you represent kind of the cybersecurity industry and defenders. How do they feel that this is really dramatically changing the way that they operate? And also, you mostly represent, I think, European cybersecurity companies, and there has been talk about the need for a European version of Mythos, basically. Is that something that your members feel capable of, or that they're working on?
They certainly understand the magnitude of changes that we are experiencing or are upcoming. Like, literally, I think that we do not fully comprehend yet what the AI will bring to the cybersecurity industry and to the cybersecurity domain as such. I mean, Mythos is just one out of many, basically, models that we are just discussing because it was brought to the public attention and so on. But I wouldn't say that it's a wise idea to focus only on this particular instance. I think that we need to think about the consequences of the technological breakthrough as such. And again, we are talking about a little bit in the context of the regulations here. So obviously, that's going to be a challenge also from the compliance point of view. But again, coming back to debunking myths, to me, it's easy to say that, okay, our regulations, they don't keep up with the technological development. Yes, we know it, but it's nothing new under the sun. That's the nature of the game, right? But in this particular case with AI, we are talking about tectonic changes of all the all the fields that you can imagine in context of cybersecurity. Defense strategies, education skills, business models, capabilities, technologies, everything. Like 2 years from now, that's my personal view, we're going to wake up in a completely different reality.
So why does that change compliance specifically?
Sorry?
Why does that change compliance? So take, for example,
okay, so let's
CRA
take the CRA, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so vulnerability management will look completely differently, right? So with the Mythos model, we can see that the discovery, training, exploitability of the vulnerabilities is a completely different game right now. And you need to change the classical way how you handle them. So it's no longer going to be about, I don't know, focusing on only critical vulnerabilities that we know that exist and waiting for the patch release cycle, right? You will have to take into account low and medium levels vulnerabilities that are going to be discovered massively, and they can be chained and exploited in a completely different way. So the defenders will no longer rely on static methodologies. They will have to have constant discovery, assessment, and mitigating strategies. Then, and I don't want to dominate the rest of the conversation, so I'm going to just put it on the table, and I'm happy to expound. Open source software. Massive challenges even in front of the entire governance model, the way how we support the community so they can basically take care of security in a proper way, and the third element, legacy systems, which we all rely on.
Do companies, does the industry feel that it's basically essential to use cyber AI tools like Mythos or others to comply? Is that effectively a requirement now?
There will be no other way. There is no chance that human can basically face in a meaningful way what the technology brings. Forget about it. It's just gone. Like, this era is closed.
And Marketa, obviously we're talking about the relationship between technology and regulation here. You are writing a piece of cybersecurity legislation. How much are you taking into account things like Mythos and other AI tools when you're writing this now? Is this really going to change the way that you write this piece of legislation? Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, the legislation has been already written, technically, by the European Commission, and they have not foreseen such progress yet. That's why I do agree that this era is over to some extent, but it doesn't mean that we can't make systemic changes also in the regulation. So it means it will be applied in a harmonized manner across the whole of European Union that will at least address a little bit of what's to come. Inherently, we will have to rely on a lot of companies and industry to keep up with what regulations cannot ever keep up with. But we can give them an environment in which they can thrive, in which they can also operate safely, and in which they have predictable, environment, and of course in which ideally, and I don't say again that it needs to be just European companies, but in which they are not forced, into obscurity by monopolies or oligopolies that just were there first. Because with AI and also every other, to be really honest, digital tool, it's who comes first stays first, and that was the US. China had very specific environment, dumping and everything. So yes, they are coming at the forefront, but Europe just does not have that. So we really need to some extent, protect that so that our companies can work in that environment. And that's something that regulation can definitely help with.
So you've been saying quite a lot about this relationship between sort of big players and market dominance and security. Is that going to, again, feed into your version of the legislation in some specific way? What might that actually look like in practice?
I wasn't necessarily not talking about big players, or you mean the regulation of big players? Well, as I said, they would need to oblige by the rules that we set up. So that might technically, to some extent, limit them. But overall, I think that the main word I would like to use is trust and trusted innovation, because a lot of people put innovation and security as opposites, but it's not true. We don't need to put them as opposites as long as the innovation is trusted. And yes, that might mean it's in the European Union, but it's not about it's just European. There can be many adversary players also within the European field. However, it's about us setting expectations, setting up the rules, setting what we want them to do, and then choosing the ones that are obliged by it. And it's also leading by example, to be really honest, because a lot of people ask me, oh, but if everybody needs to transfer to someone else, I don't know, from Amazon to Schwarz or whatnot, that will be very costly also for Schwarz and everyone. And I say, let's start with the trust. That's super important. If no European institution is using that, if no European government in national member state is using that, then I have a favorite example. If you are an employee and your employer tells you set up some cloud services, and you go with Amazon and it falls, they will tell you it's fine. Everybody uses Amazon, so I am not mad at you. But if you go with some obscure European cloud provider and it falls, your employer will probably kick you out, because why are you threatening our whole business with this little European experiment of yours, right? But if we put trust into these services and we lead by example, then it puts the employees and employers of the world into another position, because they can go with the trusted service that the French government and that the European Commission is already using.
Okay. I want to sort of ask one last, much wider question, which is, I think, when you cover cybersecurity, as I do, the news is kind of unrelentingly negative, basically. We're talking about sort of nation-state threats and all the consequences that they have, as well as cybercrime and so on. And now we're talking about this sort of game-changing AI tools that can hack everything instantly. Do you see, all three of you, any improvements in the near future? We're talking about how to regulate. Do you think things are actually going to get any better? And if so, how? And if not, how might we move towards a more positive space? Sonia.
Yeah, for me, one of the big positives and things that bring me hope, actually, is that we are having these discussions in a mainstream way, and that we are able to engage with policymakers on these topics. That's something that is quite new, honestly. It used to be that digital policy, cyber policy was a really kind of edge field. I was seen as almost like an outlier for caring about this even before I joined Merix. And now this is key and is also seen by many people as key for our future resilience, for our future prosperity. And that to me is a really positive development, because I do believe that when people who know a lot about how to write good regulation, for instance, put their minds together with people who know a lot about these specific technologies, we can achieve really good regulation. We can make sure that there are a lot of positives on the horizon, even when the world is not necessarily moving in the direction we were all hoping for, at some point at least.
I am actually very optimistic, because we have CSA2 as a regulation, we have China freaking out about it, we have a commission stopping the funding of projects of Chinese inverters in renewables projects. We have so many of these positive developments. We have Poland, UK, Israel stopping the electric vehicles from entering their military areas and some airports. So I see a lot of development. Maybe it's too late to some extent. I agree with you that we who are in the cybersecurity realm are panicking for decades now already, and the world is just catching up, but it is catching up.
Do you want a very quick last one from you before we go to a Q&A?
Sure. So to be optimistic, let's not forget that again, and we mentioned that AI development can significantly increase the effectiveness of the defense strategies. So let's keep it in mind as well. It's not only like the threat behind it. Second element, and maybe that's going to be quite provocative. You know that cybersecurity is one of those domains that we don't have that many people, enough people to basically cover all the risks and work in the industry. So I have a feeling that AI can actually help a little bit with the workforce issue and shortage, simply because we will have a lot of things automated. And the last element, very quickly, and maybe from a different angle, look, cybersecurity is a super profitable part of our economy. Basically, we are talking about the 10% of the compound annual growth rate when it comes to this particular segment. And I can already tell you that there is a lot of good European companies basically going towards cybersecurity and AI and doing quite nice business. So I think this is going to be good for the economy as well.
They see good money in it. Yeah, okay. Okay, I'd like to pass the floor to the audience. There is a microphone on this side. If you'd like to ask a question, please stand up, state your name and your organization, and please make it a question, not a comment. There's one just here, at the front here.
Hello, I'm Chiara Merlino from Square Management. I have a question to all the speakers. These days we have been discussing about the need for the EU to transition to more sovereignty when it comes to AI and cloud services. I was wondering if then, since the points made are cybersecurity is a sovereign matter, if you see the transition to EU sovereignty in AI and cloud services as an essential complementary piece to the future framework. Thank you.
Anyone wants to take that first? Please, yeah.
I can try. Thank you so much for this question. So 2 points on that. To me, sovereignty is absolutely a must. I mean, like, this is a concern that we should take very seriously, but it's going to be an empty world in Europe unless we're going to develop a lot of European capabilities that can actually have a meaningful contribution to the market. So I think that, this discussion should not only be about regulating and so on, but also finally start thinking about the industrial strategy that would basically help us to grow and boost what we have in Europe. And secondly, is it necessary to move away from the foreign technologies? No, I think that part of the strategy is also to impose controls that would basically enable us to mitigate risks, right? So it's a combination of both, I would say.
I already spoke on this matter to some extent. Yes, I absolutely agree. It's an absolute necessity. And we have not really touched upon other parts. We were more talking like about the hardware, I would say. But, cybersecurity also consists of protecting our elections, protecting our democracies. And there's already plenty of actors that are trying to play against us. And this is one of the only ways that we can ensure that we keep our democracies.
Yeah, I 100% agree, and I also think that a lot of these big cloud providers have not been incentivized to put cybersecurity first, and so they haven't. And we can see this with how long the Microsoft Exchange hack that China was carrying out was actually going on, and even after it had been publicized 6, 12, 18 months later, there were still ways to use it to compromise specific accounts. So because there is no strong regulation in the US for most of these companies, and they're based in the US, they are very used to treating cybersecurity more as an afterthought, in my opinion. And the new regulation could indeed make sure that whoever will provide the cloud services of the future in Europe doesn't treat cybersecurity as an afterthought, because it can be a good growth driver for a lot of European companies as well, because there are honestly so many ways we need to disrupt this market as well.
We have a bit less than 2 minutes, so if there is someone with a... Hey. There's a microphone just there, moving along.
Hi, thank you. My name is Christian. I'm from Deutsche Telekom, and I wanted to pose a question following up on Ms. Gogorova's comment about the NIS2 directive, stating that it's a directive, not a regulation, which was a mistake because it limits harmonization across borders. But there is a reason why NIS2 was a directive, namely that it ties so closely into national security concerns, so the only way to get it to work would be to do minimum harmonization so that member states could still, satisfy their own national security concerns. These concerns are also part of the debate around the CSA2, so how do you address the concerns by several member states that this encroaches on national security competence?
You have less than a minute to answer that.
Thank you for the question. I have to, unfortunately, for many, strongly disagree with this perception of cybersecurity threats by the national member states. I do not think that cybersecurity threats have borders, and I do think that if you are a country that's at its peak of cybersecurity, if you have neighboring countries or even anybody using similar services who does not oblige by certain cybersecurity rules, you are vulnerable too. So if the member states consider it their national security, which I do respect, but I disagree with, because this is European security, and only together we can protect our grids, our networks, and our services and critical infrastructure.
Okay, that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much to Antonia, Marketa, and Joanna for sharing your insights and your knowledge. Up next, I'm going to leave the floor to our partner Broadcom to close the morning session. So please remain seated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.